Thank you very much. So imagine, I'm going to keep this short. Imagine you're a buyer and a retailer. Imagine it's a large retailer. And go ahead and feel free to imagine it's Walmart. It's a very large retailer. I don't know if you sort of have seen the scale that Walmart has relative to its competitors, but it's multiples larger than others. It has tremendous influence. So imagine you're a buyer in a retailer that has been targeted by several organizations in the nonprofit community that are environmental organizations, social organizations, to improve your social performance. Imagine that your CEO has gone on record, imagine it's 2005 when he does this, as declaring the company is going to use its market power to make a difference in supply chains throughout the world. So estimates range around 60% of environmental and social impacts are in some way or another involve consumer goods. Retailers sell most of those consumer goods. Retailers are at points of convergence in supply chains. Retailers are particularly influential members of supply chains. NGOs are not stupid, they're strategic. NGOs know who to target to make things happen. You're the largest retailer, and there you've got it. So you're a buyer in the company, and you are now tasked with making procurement decisions that include sustainability considerations. 90% of your footprint, of your company's footprint, is outside of your company's boundaries. It's in the supply chains upstream or in the consumer's homes and landfills or recycling facilities downstream. You're not trained as an environmental scientist, you're not trained as a social scientist, you're trained as a buyer. You've got a budget of about $1 billion. So as an individual, you've got responsibility for $1,000 million. That is a large number, that is a lot of responsibility, and you've got to figure out how to do this in a credible way. How would you do that? Right, so most of your suppliers are coming to you with claims because they're not stupid either. There are very few people who are stupid in this world, right? They're coming to you responding to your CEO's call, right, with what they consider to be credible claims about their products, and most of them, because they're not sustainability experts either, are mostly focused on packaging. Most consumers, if you ask them, right, what is the environmental impact of a consumer product, most of them are going to go directly to packaging. Why? It's because it's what they take off of the product, it's what they throw away, it's what goes into their local landfill, it's what they see. So is recycled packaging sufficient, right, to make a claim that a product is sustainable or not? You don't know. Turns out not many people do know. This is a complex problem. So the question is, what do you need to make those decisions? And it's not just you, it's all of your colleagues in the buying rooms throughout your company, and it's all of the other retailers out there that are under similar pressures, problem to solve that. So what would a system of measurement reporting require to be able to make good decisions? And that's what the consortium was created to solve. That's the dilemma we were created to help solve. And here is very, very basically what we have done. This is a very basic overview of the measurement reporting system we've created. One, it's multiple issue. So water is important. Climate is important, biodiversity is important, social issues are important. There are a lot of important issues. There are lots and lots, hundreds in fact, of certifications out there, right, that address things like rainforests, address things like biodiversity, address things like water issues, but they tend to be hit and miss either in terms of issues or hit and miss in terms of the sectors that are covered there. So you need a system that's not hit and miss. You need a system that's comprehensive with respect to issues. You need a system that's comprehensive with respect to sector coverage. If you're a retailer, that's what you need. You need a system that's credible or is viewed as credible by your key stakeholders, not just the environmentalists and the social organizations, activist organizations that have targeted you, but your consumers need to be convinced that this is credible. Other key stakeholders need to be convinced that the system is credible. And what's the institution that most of us regard as the most credible institution for these kinds of claims? science, right? It's generally regarded, not universally, but generally regarded that if you go to science and you vet claims against scientifically reviewed and published research, you're likely to end up with the most credible decision-making system, the best information you can get. What else? Well, you ideally will have a system that's had given an opportunity to multiple stakeholders to have input, right? So the environmentalist organizations, the social organizations are important. Scientific community is important, but of course businesses themselves have a lot of information that's absolutely critical to these decisions, and the decisions need to be economically sustainable as well as environmentally and socially sustainable. So you need a process that has an opportunity for multiple stakeholders to weigh in as you're creating the measurement reporting system. And then finally, you need a system that is multinational. If your company, and most, all supply chains these days are pretty much global, right? There are very few purely domestic supply chains left in the world. You need a system that accommodates and accounts for the global impacts that transcend political borders. So faced with those needs, Walmart and other retailers, Kroger is a member, Marks & Spencer is a member, Best Buy is a member, I can say it now, Amazon is a member, etc. Most retailers are looking for some kind of a system to make better decisions about the sustainability impacts of the products they're selling. And we set out to try and create that kind of a system. So that's where I'm not going to bore you with detail, but by golly, I could. I'm a professor, I'm qualified. But we created a system that solicits input from multiple stakeholders on hotspots for consumer products, hotspots being the environmental and social impacts in those products' life cycles that have the greatest impact. We vetted the solicitations against the scientific literature, graded the quality of the evidence, and created a measurement and reporting system that's now in use by Walmart and other retailers at scale to make procurement decisions. Right now, Walmart obviously is the largest. I think they have over $200 billion in product covered by the systems and using information that's being reported to them, including by L'Oreal, against the information as well. So the theory here, the reason we're doing this is not just for the sake of information. Information is good, but of course if information is not used, it's not worth anything, right? The theory pertinent to this particular gathering is this should create a demand, right? This should facilitate the creation of demand for new technologies to solve the problems that are being uncovered through this kind of a system, and that's certainly what we're hoping will happen through what we're doing. Lots of other things about the consortium I'm happy to babble on about. Just ask me the question and I'll babble on, but I'm not going to babble on right now. Before I hand this off to the next speaker, Mr. Eckhart, I was asked by Mark to define sustainability. Right? So that's a PhD seminar's worth of a question to answer, and I'm not even going to try. I think most of us are familiar with the standard definition, the Brundtland Commission definition of current generation's needs being met such a way that future generations' needs are not compromised, which is a perfectly fine definition that's damnably difficult to actually implement, right? It's very difficult to come up with fine line sort of designations of what constitutes as a sustainable or unsustainable activity. What I will say is this, because I get asked this question a lot. It's a lot easier to spot an unsustainable activity than it is to spot a sustainable activity, right? So in the world at large, we can point to a few pressing problems that need our immediate attention and that demand better information than we've got right now. It would include climate, it would include water issues, it would include biodiversity, it would include some of the most pressing social issues, et cetera. So I think it's easier to define unsustainability than it is to define sustainability. And I'm just going to leave it at that for the moment, and again, happy to answer any questions. So Al, do you want to introduce the next speaker, or do you want me to? Mr. Eckhart is from CitiBank. He is, well, I'm going to let you tell you who he is and what he does. Thank you very much.
I am Mike Eckhart and from CitiBank. That's true. Maybe I'll say a few more. But it's great to be here. How many of you are students? I understand students came in. Raise your hand. How many students? We got some. Okay, I'm glad. I teach the environmental finance course at Columbia University Graduate School for International Affairs. So come see me later. And I'd like to teach it here sometime too. But Mark, oh yeah, we have slides. Good, thanks. While you're doing that. So Mark Grobmeyer and I are great, great friends. I really admire him and what he's doing and what the Clinton White House did and all of that gang. And I'm looking here to see if Bob Nash is still here. Where's Bob? I had dinner with last night. Anyway, he was the director of personnel hiring in the Clinton White House. So he's here. A lot of other good people here. Louis Schick, I haven't seen for a while, New York investor. David Stevens, we just talked a minute ago. Haven't seen David in a couple of years. Worked a little bit on sort of guarantees, which I'll get to in a little while. And Rachel McManus and Savita Sridharan I had dinner with last night, a couple of the new pioneers on off-grid solar and that. And I did off-grid solar in India and Africa in 1996. That would be 20 years ago. So I go back to 1976, actually, joining Booz Allen's energy practice, and I was given the task of building a practice in the new energy technologies, which I did. And I'm still living off that heritage and did that for 5 years. And won a really wonderful contract through the DOE, the Department of Energy, which turned out to be funded by Jimmy Carter himself. And they only wanted 7 hard copies of reports. We couldn't keep a copy, and they were never published. And I only found this out 2 years into the contract that they were being done for the president. So that really motivated me to do some good work. And it included the first national study on PV and wind power and coal gasification and breeder reactor and that kind of stuff. So I've literally been in this for 40 years and 6 months, and so that's, thank you. I thought I was going to get a phone call from the HR department at Citi. Oh, there's Bob. About 3 years ago when it was due for retirement. I'm still waiting for the phone call. But look, if you started in this business 2 or 3 years ago, this is a headache. I mean, there are so many problems here. New presidents got it, all these issues getting in your way. But if you started in this back when it was at 0, these are the good old days. This is called success. This is huge. You've heard several talks about the success in India going on, how efficiency has changed. And I was in India in 1980, year 2000 actually. I'm thinking 98. I was in India so much. I got the award Renewable Energy Man of the Year of India for 1998. I mean, I told my wife, I think I'm going to India too much, But anyway, it's been a great run. So let me talk about, what Citi's doing in sustainability, but then I'm going to transition to where we're going with all of this and where I believe we need to go. Because this is the era of success. We do have the answers. It does look daunting, but in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to share with you how I see how the answers stack up. Sustainability is a great attempt to define sustainability. I agree with everything you said right there. But I hope you can read some of this. But Citi's been in this, actually, we never say publicly, and this is private, so I can say I think we were the first bank to kind of move on this going back 15 years. And steadily every year has built up, really originally around the citizenship tag, which has environmentalism and sustainability and lots of good things, and corporate citizenship in that. But joining up with the UNEP Financial Initiative, we were one of the first 3 members of that. Citi actually, if you know what the Equator Principles are, which are environmental review criteria for project financings globally, the Equator Principles, that idea came from Citi. The woman who put it together recruited 3 other banks to have air cover. So the 4 of them wrote the Equator Principles. You move along here, 2013, I used that same model. We needed something in the bond markets so there's no cheating and misrepresentation and greenwashing, something actually not to protect the world at large, but just to protect the integrity of the bond market and its players, including us. Reputational risk is something we worry about a lot. And what if our client misrepresents how green they are and we issue a bond and all heck's going to break loose? And this discussion went on for a number of months in 2013, and I was pushing on it gently but hard. And we tried to get environmental groups to write a guideline for the green bonds market, and And they just kept trying to redefine green like sustainability. That's not what we needed. Let the bond market determine that. But we needed an integrity thing, and I got so frustrated, I actually wrote the Green Bond Principles in 3 hours on a flight from JFK to San Francisco one night. You know, everybody's laughing. We've all done that, right? It's like, okay, take out your computer, get another glass of white wine, and just do it yourself, right? And worked with Suzanne Buchter from BAML, Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Actually had dinner with her the night before, and then we worked on a draft, and then we came out with it. And today it's a global standard adopted by over 200 institutions run by the International Capital Markets Association. And we're going to do somewhere between 80 and 90 billion dollars of tagged green bonds this year, and it's growing at 50 to 100% a year. And we're on the way. And from the beginning, we said we're going to write a guideline that will take the global bond markets to $1 trillion in sustainable investing. $1 trillion. That's the target. And I'll get back to that number in a minute, but it's going to be even larger than that. I'll tell you right now, a slide later says that we're underwriting $12 trillion a year in the bond market globally. 90% of that's government, 10% is corporate. Think about, while I'm talking, what percentage of that has to be green if we're going to have a sustainable future? I leave you with that question to think about, and believe me, it's not just $1 trillion. So Citi has this. I'm very proud to work at Citi. I know all the big banks went through a bit of a stress there back about 6 or 8 years ago, and did some not proper things, and all those folks are gone, and all that's been corrected. I can say that our CEO today, Mike Corbat, is the model of a good guy, and he hires good guy and good women, and has a strong moral as well as financial lead to what we do. We have tags of great corporate. We just this morning at 8 o'clock we had our end of the year managing director worldwide call, where we kind of reviewed where we are for the year, and we're very proud that we've really adhered to something called responsible finance. That includes everything. That's sustainability, taking care of the client, not doing the wrong thing, being economical, making a profit, and doing it right and legally and so forth. That's the phrase we use for the totality of it. So I'm very proud. Long history, and it's going to keep going. All right, now how we define our work in this zone of sustainability is in 3 parts: environmental finance, environment and social risk management, and then operations and supply chain. That's our own, what we're doing ourselves, not for our clients. But the first 2, so I'm the global head of environmental finance, and I'll get to our goals in that, but as it says here, 2 years ago, we set a goal of doing not less than $100 billion in financings over a 10-year period, 2014 to 24. And I don't have a bank account with that money, and it's not how a bank works. So I get all the responsibility and none of the authority. You get that? All the responsibility, none of the authority. So if it goes well, it's good. All right, then the environmental and social risk management, that was at Equator Principles, and other things like that we have staff that very formally reviews the environmental and social risk aspects of all the deals we do internally. Nice, quiet team. You'll never meet them. But we do that very, very responsibly. And then the operations and supply chain, I didn't put the slide, I took the slide out this morning that had all of our awards and stuff. We're regularly chosen as one of the greenest banks, the most sustainable bank, just because of our internal supply chain and the amount of everything, energy, water, and everything we're saving just through conscious efforts. And then engagement and transparency has been the hallmark of this whole thing, of having good working relationships with the environmental groups. Not just for PR's sake, but because they're intelligent people trying to make a point. Let's listen to them. Let's have a dialogue. Let's let them know that we are listening, and we would like them to listen to where we're coming from. So that dialogue is quite important, and I think many of the other banks have copied us. In summary, on the $100 billion goal, it's not as complicated as it seems, because we have 32,000 corporate banks. Citi does, we have $2 trillion balance sheet. We do work we have offices in 100 countries, doing work in 160 countries. We're doing work in support of our big multinational clients in all these countries, and every country where there's not warfare going on, because we're not going to put our employees in that kind of a risk. So that's a bit of a red line. But this is a big organization. We have a little division called Transaction and Treasury Services. Citi was founded 202 years ago as the country's first trade finance bank out of New York City, doing trade finance with Europe. Okay, that's the core business for us. B of A started in retail banking. J.P. Morgan started financing industry, steel mills, and railroads. So we all have a different heritage. Our core business is trade finance. And that little division, making no loans, nothing, no capital markets, just transactions for all the companies, moves $3 trillion a day. Just let that, I can't get over that. That's 3,000 billion. 3 billion million. I mean, that's such a large number, it's incomprehensible. And our little one bank does that with 3 trillion a day. So we have a lot of clients coming to us as they move into renewables. Our scale of business has skyrocketed. When we set the goal of 100 billion in late 2013, we had just done 10 billion in 2013 of financings. So we said, well, let's just keep that going for 10 years. That's a good goal. In 2014, though, we did 24. And in 2015, we did 48. That's what's happened in this field. That's why I say this is success. It's really going to scale as our big old clients have come into the space as the space has gone mainstream. That's what's just happened in the last few years. In 2013, we financed the IPO of the first YieldCo. We wrote the Green Bond Principles. We did the Credit Suisse, to their credit, did the first solar securitization, if you know what that is, and we did the first energy efficiency securitization, all in 2013. That was the watershed year, and we're past it. We're in the capital markets. And as others have alluded, those investors are very interested in finding acceptable debt and equity investments. And you can see there, we have a lot of different technology angles and finance angles to do. We have clients flooding at us, trying to get us to do these transactions for them, either in banking or capital market origination, with support from transaction services and all the other trust things that we do. So it's a great space to be in, and I hope everybody will try to find a way to work with us. Now, shifting gears, I ran into this photograph, getting personal now. When you see that big ball of the earth with Saudi Arabia in the photograph and all that taken from the moon, I mean, how are you going to deal with that? Tell me about sustainability. I saw this photograph, and I've been using it for over 10 years because the light bulbs went on when I saw this photograph. Oh, God, of course. How thin is the atmosphere? And those little prickly things in the middle up there, those are thunderstorms. And they flatten. I see how they flatten out? There's no air above that. That's 50,000 feet. Why did the Concorde fly at 53,000 feet? Because there's not a lot of air to support it above that. The atmosphere is so shockingly thin. Now I get it. If you're spewing out emissions over 150 years, I can see filling it up with the wrong thing. And once it's filled up, it's over. You can't recover. So that motivated me to shift from not just clean energy, renewables, environment, but to add the climate dimension and become very strongly, and I'll go through this in a second. I just want to share with you something that motivated me when I realized what's as an engineer, what do we mean by the atmosphere and why is this so important? And I hope you see the same thing. And I found out that so many people in audiences that I speak to have never read the IPCC fifth report. Have you? And I had to read it once because I was asked to give the climate speech to an annual meeting of the oil CEOs, which happens every year in Oslo. It's kind of like Davos for those guys and their staff, about 100 people. And I asked to change the title, but they said no. So the weekend before, I actually read the whole report. It's 3 inches thick, so I know why you didn't read it, okay? But I'm going to make your life easy, and I like to put these in here to say these are right out of the report, and these are the facts that the deniers who haven't read the report, and if they choose not to, they can question the science if they don't read the report. But if you sat in my audience, you can't say that anymore, okay? And I use this with bankers, and I put this up for Rex Tillerson and the other CEOs, and I'm still alive to talk about it. So, and I think I did persuade them. But here's the facts on the gaseous buildup in that atmosphere I was talking about. See, and this is as of 2015, or 2012, 40% up. CH4 is methane. That's 21 times more damaging to the atmosphere per unit released, and it is skyrocketing as Siberia, the ice melts, and all that methane starts leaking up into the atmosphere, and then you've got NOx. So what does that mean is, these are the facts. Again, this is out of the report. The last 3 decades have, in fact, had higher temperatures as we're going along. This is inescapable. There's the cause, there's the effect, and the scariest one is this one, which is the actual temperature as it's actually moved in the past 50 years. We've actually increased by 1 degree C already. And we've put enough into the atmosphere that we are guaranteed to go to 1.7. Guaranteed. So why we're talking about 1.5, I don't know. Because if we stop all emissions right now, full stop, we will go to 1.7 degrees, which means if we keep going, we're going past that 2 degrees like a train wreck, right? This is what this is telling us. This is the fact of the matter. And the scary one is that light blue in the center. You know, there's a heat-moving Ferris wheel going in the Atlantic, keeping Europe warm. And if that's circulating the Gulf Stream, if that stops, then Europe freezes like it did 1,000 years ago. Well, that light blue, what's that light blue? That's the cold air coming off the glaciers melting in Greenland. It's happening, and it's even measurable. That's the scariest thing I've seen in a long time. They don't make a big deal about it. I don't know why. But there it is, actually cooling, and that cooling will stop the elevator from happening. So we've got some real consequences here, and that change will happen in the space of 10 years. It's not going to take 100 years. All that's just going to shift. So this has now become urgent. So it's important. We got the facts, can't deny them, and it's important. So I love all the work, and I work with the IEA, I work with IRENA, I work with REN 21, I work with the Atlantic Council. Just make time for them, because working on these solutions, and now I'm going to work with Mark and this team, work is important. I'll tell you why at the end of this. But here are the IEA, International Energy Agency's policy scenarios for dealing with this, and you can see, relating to what I said a minute ago, the 450 scenario, that's 450 parts per thousand of CO2 in the air, is the ceiling for this 2-degree maximum shift in temperature. And you can see the implication is we're going to shut down the fossil fuel industry, period. We stop everything. To get to and this is what I shared with you a minute ago. Now this says the same thing. To stop this at 2 degrees C, we have to drive this to zero pretty quickly. Are all of you ready to do that? I don't think so. So we don't have those answers, but the magnitude and urgency become ever more important. Now, to me, as a business person and as a banker and a financier, to me, you got to turn this into an investment opportunity. You can't just whine and say we have to stop the world. Not going to happen. We've got, in my view, we have to invest our way out of this, not spend our way out of it or stop our way out of it. There's a certain stoppage that has to happen. There's a certain spending. But the bulk of it has to be investing in a new world that's going to displace the old world in this time frame. And to me, I came up with 5 words: efficient, smart, clean, renewable, and a new word, decarbon. That these are the 5 things we're going to need to do, and this is things that we are doing, and we're going to need to learn to finance, and I'll talk about that in a second too, that creates the new world where we're going. Like, where are we going? Do we have an answer? And I'm saying, yes, we do. 5 words, right there. We do those 5 things in mass, at scale, and we're going to put the past in the past. Last slide, just to summarize, to get into finance. And so the capital we need is something like 1 to 2 trillion, 1 to 3 trillion a year. Lots of studies, the IEA, the UN, you can find many of those, that to address this issue at this scale, we have to be investing at 1 to 3 trillion a year. Now, we're investing at 350 billion a year right now. And you say, well, that's terrible, that's small. Well, wait a minute, back from when I was at zero, 350 billion a year is, wow, this is huge. So we have to go up by another factor of 3 to 10 to address the scale of the problem, but at least we're not at zero anymore. We're up, and it's a matter of accelerating, and the answer is get this to the capital market where the money is. And to that point, the public sector is scared to death of this, and many of you are part of that, and you rightly should be, because there isn't 1 to 3 trillion in the public sector anyway, because the public sector is $73 trillion in debt today against, guess what? A global GDP of 73 trillion. This year they're the same number. A whole year of GDP the public sector has borrowed ahead on. There's no capacity for additional borrowing against that unless the GDP starts going up, which some people like Donald Trump for that, and Rex Tillerson, but get that number going up, then you can borrow more. If GDP doesn't go up, we're frozen for the public sector for the most part, except just turning over and replacing existing money. And the other issue there is the public sector has a system that doesn't deal with such large problems because the public sector works, as we all know, on annual budgets that are set by political priorities. Okay, they debate in Congress and decide how to allocate the budget. The UN debates and then they allocate their budget. The whole public sector is a debate allocating an annual budget and no long-term commitments. Well, that doesn't deal very well with a long-term, big problem like this, when no annual budget is ever going to be big enough to move the needle, why do that? And it's not doable. And the other aspect is the institutions, which I call multilateral here, the world banks and so forth, are shockingly small. I love them. They're important. I work with them. We need them, but we need them to be bigger. The World Bank, again, God bless them, puts out about $30 billion a year to their member countries in debt, loans, so forth. One little bank, Citi, we do $30 billion in that kind of activity every 3 days. We do $10 billion a day. You know, the Green Climate Fund has $10 billion. Well, our debt capital market team does that in 1 day, every 5 days. Does that $10 billion. It's phenomenal how big the money markets are in the capital markets in the world. And the public sector, the World Bank spent $30 billion a year for 30 years. They're protecting, and rightly so, a AAA bond rating by not growing, not expanding, not risking. But we've got to find a way to get them to scale up a bit to deal with the scale of the problem here. At $30 billion a year, they're a minor percentage of that $1 to $3 trillion. We've got to find a way to get that sector, a way to get them to grow without reducing their bond ratings. Now, the private sector, on the other hand, has $205 trillion in the capital markets. That's a T, not a B. 205. That's $65 trillion in the equity markets, $140 trillion in the bond market, turning over at a rate of $12 trillion a year in new issuance. Now, 90% of that is public sector bonds, all your government bonds, while they're in debt. Okay? Well, $1.2 trillion of it a year is corporate bonds. I mean, that's a pretty big number. That's the same number we need over here, plus all the public. And in the stock market, $65 trillion there, issuing just under $1 trillion a year. It's remarkably small compared to the bond market. So the stock market at $1 trillion a year and the corporate bond market at $1 trillion a year, okay, they're there at that level. On top of that, you got the whole public sector. And again, I question how much more the public sector can borrow for this or any other purpose without growing GDP to support it. But we got $2 trillion a year in the corporates. And I asked you before, what percentage of all capital issues have to be sustainable if we're going to have a sustainable future? Lady saying all of them. Thank you. Okay. So what I'm showing you is the scale of money that's moving is the same as the scale of money we're asking for. Very, very interesting. It's almost the identical number. If we can just continue to shift the use of those funds, green bonds. What's the Green Bond Principles? It's a guideline on the use of funds of a bond. It actually turned out to be more revolutionary than I thought. It's the first use of funds guideline in the history, standard in the history of the bond market, which has always used general corporate purposes as the use of funds of a bond. Now we're into use of funds in a bond. This is a whole new world. I was meeting with the president of one of the ratings companies at their request. Staff wanted me to talk him into letting them work on a guideline of ratings of green bonds. And he said he just wasn't comfortable until we get a better definition of green. Okay? And I said, well, I'll tell you what, sir, just for conversation's sake, would you give me your definition of the word creditworthy? And everybody laughed. They exist because nobody can agree on a definition. So they created a language called bond ratings to deal with that. So we don't have a definition of creditworthy, we have a language. And what I asked them to do, and they're working on it, is we don't need a definition of what's green, we need a better language to communicate about what's green. So if an investor needs AAA green, an issuer can say, I meet that criteria, and they can talk about that in some way. And then the bond market functions, and there doesn't have to be an NGO in a corner stamping things as green or something. So you see, this is all developing fast, but in these spaces. But we've only been in the capital markets 3 years. We have the green bond principles. We have definitions of green. We're going for language of what's green. Standard & Poor's and Moody's have both issued some preliminary guidelines that they will evaluate green bonds. And so all this is moving very rapidly, and I'm very pleased with it. My closing thought is everybody should do what they have the resources to do. And don't try to do what you don't have resources to do. And what the public sector has is power. And what the private sector has is money. Can we put these two together in such a way that we can... Boy, somebody's been waiting for somebody to say that for a long time. She's tearing out her hair. Yeah, exactly. And the way I reduce that down, and I know this is just an example of what can be done, but I've actually begun to call for, even speaking publicly, that in my view, the Green Climate Fund of the UN, which is $10 billion, that's a trivial amount of money for lending. Like, let's not waste our time. I would love to see that fund become the reserve fund for a global guarantee agency for the offtake contracts of clean energy projects, solar, wind, and so on. Because the reason we can't lend with your money, with your mother's money on our fiduciary duty is because Zambia is risky. We can't trust they're going to make that payment every month for 20 years under that offtake contract. That contract needs to be guaranteed by Zambia. And then there has to be a backup guarantee by a global agency to back up that guarantee to be sure we get our payment that project gets its payment and they'll repay our loan. So it's called offtake guarantees. I wrote a paper called the Clean Energy Project Assurance Corporation. I could have said agency because that's what it needs to be, but I'm a bank and I can't be lobbying government, so it's good air cover to call it a corporation. We'll see. But it literally is an insurance company that puts not insurance but guarantees on these flows of money, on these projects. If that was the case, and each project would have to pay a premium, like insurance, to get that guarantee, so it could be self-supporting, i.e. you don't have to fund it with taxpayer money, then you can imagine that basically any wind farm or solar project or clean energy activity in the world with that guarantee would have a near investor-grade quality risk rating. Aha! Anywhere in the world, imagine, India, Zambia, Kazakhstan, with that backup guarantee could be a BBB minus investor-grade bond offer. And imagine how that would transform it. And that is what I'm saying at the end. If the public sector would step up to what they can do, and they have the resources enough to guarantee something and the power they have the power, remember I said power? Because when a project goes wrong, it takes a phone call from somebody powerful to get it fixed. And that's what the public sector knows how to do. In the private sector, the little developer of the wind farm, phone call, not getting, no, you're not even answering your phone. Go away. All right, so that's why we need that public sector muscle. And if that's there, then your mother's money can be responsibly loaned to those projects because it will get repaid. So I hope that gives you a sense that those of us working the problem actually do see a solution. It's not in hand yet, but we see where this should go. And we're at scale, and now we have to multiply another tenfold with these mechanisms, and I think we're there. So thanks for listening. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Michael. That was a truly inspiring and informative talk. Outstanding. So thank you so much for that. I wish we had more time to listen more to what you have to say on all of this. Our next speaker, I don't know if he's here, Mr. Rodney Slater. Okay, I'm sorry for that. Let me turn, because people have, Mr. Jonathan Maher from L'Oreal.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you to the, here we are. That's right, thank you. Thank you to the Clinton Presidential Center and, of course, the Club de Madrid and the P80 Foundation, who are both hosting this. It's an honor to be here today. Actually, I'm really excited to be part of this, because this morning, as I was listening to some of the presentations earlier, talking about ways to deploy new technologies, ways to scale certain solutions, I thought I could possibly present an interesting viewpoint in terms of how do we tackle these same challenges from a consumer goods standpoint. Because as we talk about solutions and as we talk about technologies, it's also how do we try to apply those for a sector, a company that produces, honestly, disposable consumer goods, which is our case. Perfect. Sorry for, I'm just going to show a couple of sort of the corporate figures, but it's just so you can appreciate L'Oreal. I mean, we're actually the #1 beauty company in the world. So what I'm trying to get you to appreciate as we talk about this topic is, you'll see, I mean, it's our environmental impact, it's our environmental footprint across everything we do. Now, when I say L'Oreal, that's a number of different brands. Maybe some of you are, know some of these brands, of course, across, some of them are American brands, some of them are European brands, some of them are Japanese brands. But what's most important to retain is that these are products that are sold across many different channels, and more importantly, very different types of products. And I just want you to look at that bottom line, all those different types of products. Going back to what John had said earlier, when we think about solutions, environmental solutions, ways to mitigate our impact, there are both our unified policies. What can we do across maybe our raw material sourcing? What can we do across our manufacturing? What can we do across our distribution? But once we talk about these products and the product design, whether it's nail, hair care, fragrance, makeup, you name it. Each one of these products have very different life cycles. You don't source the same ingredients, you don't use these products in the same way, you don't dispose of these products in the same way, they don't have the same end of life. So a lot of our solutions are going to really have to be tailored to those realities. And it's our ability to have metrics and solutions which are somewhat nimble and that can be adaptable. So, as John said, one of the things which is very important for us from the beginning was to have science-based targets. When we say, how can we mitigate our environmental impact? These were established, we had some of these established some years ago, but essentially the more comprehensive strategy we had launched in 2013. And what we made sure is that beyond these science-based goals, which I won't run through them individually, but what you should know is that all of these are appraised. We report to independent parties. These are appraised by independent experts. I'm very proud to say that L'Oreal was named one of the only 2 companies worldwide as a AAA performance by the Carbon Disclosure Project in terms of our carbon stewardship, our water management, and our actions against deforestation. What I'd just like to talk, I realize there's a lot of topics here, but I just want to focus on 3 in terms of when we look at our value chain and how these commitments really, essentially, they mirror our value chain. Is the way we source, the way we design, the way we produce, the way we distribute, and even we're trying to think about what happens to the product once it's on the market. How is it used? How is it disposed of? I just want to focus on 2 or 3 key ways we're working on this, around the sourcing of our raw materials, our manufacturing, and also our product design. And what types of solutions have we implemented within L'Oreal? I'm going to start here in the USA. I'm proud to say I like this because, I'm going to play to the local crowd a little, because you'll see very quickly a lot of the work we've done in terms of making our manufacturing model low carbon applies across the world. I just decided today to focus on the USA because we have a wonderful illustration here in North Little Rock. What you see here is essentially our industrial footprint, our distribution centers, our manufacturing sites, and what you'll see now is across a number of these, we've installed on-site renewable infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure. Essentially solar arrays, but also some wind turbines. And today, L'Oreal, we've really decided to favor doing on-site renewable energy projects. We want them on-site. We want them connected to our facilities. We are one of the top 25 solar capacity companies in the USA, which when you consider some of the larger American companies is quite impressive. And also, we're really continuing to look for every one of these facilities for solutions. We started in some areas, we've moved into new ones. And one great example of that is right here in North Little Rock. So here I just, this is a plant, and I'm very happy. We have the plant manager, Eric Fox, here today. And we also have the head of North American Manufacturing, Richard Jones. So under their leadership, this facility and our other facilities in the USA, we've really found specific solutions in terms of lowering our CO2 emissions, our water use, and our waste. And what's interesting here is, once again, I could talk a long time about those specific solutions. I want to say a word about renewable energy. But somebody earlier had talked about data. And today, more and more, it's our ability to map these patterns, map the water use, map the energy use, and have very strong analytics around energy use, and how to make it more efficient. And here, I just have you focus your attention on the right-hand side. These are many of the collaborations we put in place. And I think today, for a company like L'Oreal, our ability to leverage partners, whether it's government partners or other partners, in terms to aid us in our ability to identify those gaps and ways to improve our performance has been really very precious and very valuable, and has allowed us to achieve the scores we have here in the USA, which exceed our global scores. But here's something which we were very proud to announce a couple of months ago, and this just goes to show how whatever the climate, whatever the realities, the local realities, we have a rule which is we have to identify renewable energy solutions wherever our facilities are. And so here are 2 great examples of that. We were able, for our largest plant worldwide, happens to be in Florence, Kentucky. It's the largest plant in terms of tonnage. It develops a number of our hair care products. And we were able to develop the largest commercial solar array in the state, an on-site solar array, which will be developed next year in Kentucky. And here in North Little Rock, We had also decided to expand. We had already had some solar. We had a first solar array, but we decided to have a larger one, a 1.2 megawatt solar array, the third largest commercial one here in the state of Arkansas. And these two projects, combined with the purchase of a certain number of locally sourced renewable energy certificates, have allowed us today to, across, it's not written here, but across all of our facilities in the USA, they will now rely on electricity which will be 100% renewable, and also for us to achieve an 80% CO2 emissions reduction from a 2005 baseline, which is our baseline, and this really exceeds the goals we've given. So we're very proud of that. So I've spoken for manufacturing, and like I said, we have people in the room who are really seminal in doing this, and I'll gladly introduce you to them if some of you would like to meet them. But beyond manufacturing is also what are we doing across our full supply chain. And when you're a company like L'Oreal, a lot of that is around the sourcing of our raw materials. If you were to take a full life cycle for L'Oreal, we know that what we call the scope 3 is really important in terms of our impact. L'Oreal, of course, understands that on this question of carbon emissions, as you very eloquently explained, in the notion that all these emissions that are entering the atmosphere, it's also our ability not just to reduce emissions, but also to ensure that we still have carbon sinks, and to continue to ensure that there's not too much deforestation so that there's a carbon balance ultimately. So a lot of what we've done in recent years is to work on that zero deforestation policy. Obviously, one of those emblematic raw materials today is palm oil. So we've moved really towards having an exemplary policy on palm oil and palm oil certificates, which we use, not certificates, I'm sorry, palm oil derivatives, which we use. They have foaming properties, they're a good emollient, so L'Oreal uses it as an ingredient. But we really wanted to ensure that not only are they RSPO certified, but that we're going a further level of traceability. Are we able to trace these derivatives and these palm oils straight to the plantation? Can we ensure that the smallholders also are getting, is it an inclusive business model? And I want to go back to what was said earlier today about the Sustainable Development Goals. L'Oreal is really aligned with the notion that there is a social justice issue here as well. Beyond the question of environmental safety, we also want to make sure that within these communities, for our supply chain, for these raw materials, that the local farmers are getting a fair wage, are getting investments in their community, are getting training. So it's a very complex issue, but it's one where on the issue of palm oil, we're really trying to make a difference for our supply chain. And then beyond that, we just have a lot of other raw materials, plant-based raw materials, shea butter, argan oil. I mean, for those of you who use our beauty products, you may recognize some of these ingredients. These are key ingredients for us, and it's our ability to ensure that for every one of those sourcings, it's sustainably sourced. Now, our goal is ultimately for all of those plant-based raw materials that we achieve 100% sustainably sourcing by 2020. We're about halfway there, and we're going to continue until we achieve it by 2020. Lastly, just before I get to this, so now really the questions become, I talked about the sourcing, upstream, I talked about the manufacturing, but I want you to take a second, because this is probably something you don't often hear about, is also eco-design. How can you design products? John was referring to this, and I want to say the Sustainability Consortium does amazing work in providing metrics to how do you measure product sustainability. But this is a huge focus for L'Oreal, because at the end of the day, we're a company that produces somewhere between, I believe, 6-7 billion products per year. And we realize that where we can contribute is our ability to design products that have a better end of life or have a better life cycle. And so these are just a few examples of how do we do that, using metrics, using tools we have, solutions, improving the packaging, lightweighting it, using more recycled material. Just by adding 30% recycled plastic, we're saving hundreds of tons of virgin plastic. And this is something we're trying to do, and we're trying to increase that threshold. We have some examples of products we're now at 50%, 75%, 100% recycled material, and using more and more ingredients that are sustainably sourced. Even when we redo products, we restage our products. How can we, when we use that moment, when you renovate a product, how can you ensure you're making it more sustainable? How can you enhance it at that moment of renovation? And here's a great example of that. We change a product, and in doing so, we make it more sustainable. And lastly, if we're going to talk about technology, one area we probably haven't heard enough about, but which is a very big deal for us, is also formulation. At the end of the day, we make products, formulas, the ones you use in your products, and how can we ensure that they have a better end of life? So what does that look like? This is a great product that just came out this year, 98% biodegradable, 97% natural origins. And for those of you who know our hair care products, when you have a product with this level of efficacy, the product, some of the ingredients that they removed, which don't necessarily have a good environmental profile, silicones, sulfates, artificial dyes, to be able to substitute those and still make the product just as effective, just as an enjoyable a product for our consumers is a real feat in technology. And this is a very, very big deal in our industry if we can start moving towards other types of raw materials, because the raw materials here I just mentioned are real staple raw materials for us, but they don't necessarily have the best environmental profile. And lastly, even that bottle you see there is 100% recycled material. So that means the bottle is entirely made of plastic from the recycling waste stream, no virgin plastic. I believe that's my last slide. So I just wanted to offer you this one example of a consumer goods company, a beauty and personal care company. Obviously not necessarily the first sector that comes to mind when you think about environmental challenges, but how we understand that for us in the 21st century, we're as equally accountable as any other company to really come up with a new sustainable business model. So thank you very much.
Thank you for, again, another very interesting and educational, informative presentation. Our next speaker is Mr. Mark Rossi.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Mark Rossi. I'm the Executive Director of Clean Production Action. We're a nonprofit organization that focuses on designing and delivering strategic solutions for safer chemicals and products and supply chains. And so it's really nice for me to be here on this panel because what we're doing is we're working at the nexus between brands, retailers, investors, and advocacy organizations in terms of creating change in chemicals and products and supply chains. And certainly what's been happening and what's really interesting in the presentations and what we see a lot is there's often a gap in the sustainability programs of corporations. And that gap is around chemicals and materials and health. And so one thing that I'm going to play a role is weaving together a talk that was given on Monday here by Dr. Ronald Hart, who highlighted that the leading cause of preventable death globally is pollution, right? And so we know that the most effective way to address pollution is to prevent it in the first place, and right, to prevent the exposure to toxic chemicals in the first place. So just to take a survey, how many of you in this room have families or friends that have had cancer? Right? So cancer is an example of something that touches all of us. And yet we know that carcinogens that are in products, that are in manufacturing, can cause cancer in people. So environmental health effects of cancer, roughly 10% of cancers are caused by carcinogens that we use in our products that are contained in manufacturing. Right? So that's a preventable disease in many cases by the chemical selections that we make. Like I work a lot with healthcare, and somebody that I work in healthcare says, well, imagine building a cancer center without carcinogens, right? So how do we make that happen? And so what my organization does is we create tools and strategies to create this communication throughout the supply chain, to create metrics, to understand the progress that we're making. And what I wanted to do today, and we've got 3 programs that are up here. One is the Chemical Footprint Project. So this is an effort to create a metric by which we can measure performance of companies in terms of managing chemicals and products across supply chains. It's equivalent to the carbon disclosure project that Jonathan mentioned, but on the chemical side. BizNGO is a collaboration of businesses and advocacy organizations working together to find common solutions to chemicals in problematic chemicals in products and manufacturing. And then Green Screen is actually a tool that evaluates chemicals and identifies inherently safer alternatives. But I want to pick up though on, and I want to really have you think about is the concept of chemical risk. And it's come up, risk has come up in a couple of the presentations, but this idea of chemical risk being the financial liabilities that companies carry because they've got toxic chemicals in their supply chains or their products, right? And so what's really interesting about this, if you've got toxic chemicals in your supply chain or in your products, right, this is a potential liability. It's sitting there every day, and it may be captivated. And it was raised earlier by Rick around the idea that you would, in terms of NGOs, and John mentioned this as well, as NGOs in terms of their campaigns targeting organizations, right? And Jonathan knows this well as L'Oreal as being a brand that's at the face of the customer, right? The brands facing the customer are the ones that are most at risk because they have hazardous chemicals in their products and supply chain. So as we think about chemical risk, the way that I frame it is one level is regulatory risk. And so this is highlighted around the increasing role of pollution in preventable deaths, right? So we know that there's going to be continued regulations. And interestingly, if I asked you, if you looked at global regulations across all sustainability endpoints, so water, waste, energy, deforestation, chemicals, year in, year out, what's the most number of regulations that are happening every year? It's around chemicals and materials. So there's data going back for the past 16 years that looks at the regulations, and every year there's more regulations than any other environmental category around chemicals and materials. And the reason, of course, is because of the pollution issue and because of the exposure issue in terms of products, right? So we see this happening constantly across the globe. So the question is, and if you're looking out at companies and saying, what's the level of performance, how well are companies anticipating regulatory risks, right? What's our lens into looking at that? Second risk, reputational risk, right? We've heard that come up a couple of times. And I'm just going to give you an example that played out around reputational risk, which I think is really interesting. So Johnson & Johnson was targeted for their baby products, like baby shampoo, for having a small amount of a chemical called 1,4-dioxane in its products. And when that story was released about 4 years ago, it went viral globally, got picked up in China, and actually you had retailers in China that were pulling J&J's products off the shelf. J&J ended up losing about 20% of market share over the course of 1 year in baby products in China. Right? So this is this reputational risk that you carry if you have a toxic chemical in your product or your supply chain. Another interesting one on the supply chain is Apple recently, right, was about 6 months ago, was in the news for having the use of N-hexane in its manufacturing process. N-hexane is used to clean the glass on the iPhones, and it causes adverse health effects to workers, right? And so all of a sudden, Apple's in the news for that. So again, and one of the challenges for companies, and we've heard it about, like, how do you manage this across the supply chain, is, well, what do you know about what's being used in your manufacturing? What do you know that's in your products? And it's been surprising, it's not surprising to the companies here at the table, but it's frequently companies actually don't know what's in their products. They don't know what's in that final product because that's been outsourced to other suppliers. So a real challenge here is to understand, what do they know about the chemicals in their products and their supply chains? And then I want to touch on the last risk in the space around chemicals of redesign risk, right? So if you're not designing out ahead of markets, then you're vulnerable to losing market share to other competitors. And so I work a lot with the healthcare sector and retailers that John's working with, and what we're seeing is that the healthcare sector actually in the US is asking for products that don't contain hazardous chemicals in their products, right? And this is, and we know it's right, the largest sector in the US, accounting for 16% of GDP, and this healthcare sector is saying, okay, what's in these products? We want to use products, right, that aren't causing adverse health effects for what we're treating in our hospitals every day. And so what we've created is the Chemical Footprint Project as a way of creating a lens into how well companies are managing their chemicals and their products and supply chains and measuring them. And so it's interesting, one of the areas that we've had a lot of uptake is around the investor community. So we currently have $2 trillion in assets under management has signed up saying, well, we want transparency into how well companies are managing their chemicals and their products. So like BNP Paribas has signed on to the Chemical Footprint Project. We're working with socially responsible investors in the US like Trillium Asset Management. And so these investors are asking companies for their Chemical Footprint Project survey score so they can get a lens into what are the chemical risks that companies are carrying because of chemicals in their products and supply chains. How well are they managing them? Are they putting in policies in place? Do they know it's there? And, I think about this conference too, and think about investors and the products that are being made. And it's a really good question to be asking, well, how are we making these products that we want to distribute globally? What's the chemicals in those products? And really be thinking about those, because if you put green chemistry in up front, then you never have the legacy issues. You don't have the pollution issues. You don't have to manage it at the end of its life. It's really easy to recycle. There's the growing demand around the circular economy, and we don't want to be recirculating products that have toxic chemicals in there, right? Because then we get exposed to them each time they get recycled. So the more that we can design out toxic chemicals and design in green chemistry, right? And that's the type of innovations we want, then we can really make that happen. And so then what we're doing to help facilitate that process is, we've created a tool that I mentioned, Green Screen, that evaluates product chemistries that enable companies to make these choices. And it eases the communication across the supply chain. So Levi Strauss has adopted the Green Screen because what they like about it is they just tell their suppliers, we want you to supply chemistry for our facilities that don't have any chemicals of high concern in there, and we're going to evaluate those chemistries using Green Screen. Hewlett-Packard did the same thing around flame retardants. They said, okay, we're going to substitute out flame retardants in computers, and we want to use inherently safer alternatives. And they just said to the suppliers, provide us with chemistries that aren't green screen, red, benchmark 1 chemicals. And so what we're doing is smoothing out this communication in the supply chain. And then what we're doing is what this Chemical Footprint Project does is also then features companies that are leaders in their space. So when you go and do the survey, you get benchmarked, and you can see where companies are scoring overall. And so this was launched last year. So this was the first year's report from data from 2015. And what's really interesting, a lot of times in this space, I get this question, well, what about SMEs, right? What about the small and medium-sized enterprises? How can they do this? And actually, the SMEs that are the companies that are performing the best are the ones that have embedded this into their thinking, into the DNA of the organization. Jonathan mentioned, the 8 million SKUs that you have to each product category. So shifting that over takes a lot of time. How do you make that shift really quickly? It's hard to make that shift really quickly when you're a large company. But for the small companies, they can build that into their DNA, and then they don't have to think about, do I have chemicals of concern? They're designing their products that have inherently safer chemicals in the first place. And we see, those companies are capturing new market share. So this one company, Beauty Counter, has really been accelerating the growth in the beauty and personal care product sector because they're selling products that are safe and healthy and efficacious in terms of their chemistry. And we're seeing that across many different sectors. So what you see is this opportunity to create new products, new innovations that are then helping to reduce exposure to hazardous chemicals. So I'm really pleased to be here, look forward to a dialogue, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. You know, we have the green screen with the chemicals. We have the green bond principles. It's very interesting to see the way there's a lot of, I guess you'd call self-regulatory, policing, reporting sort of organizations. And of course, the Bank of England is calling for banks to report the carbon footprint of their loans and so on and so forth. And I think we'll make a lot of progress over time as you get more information in the market and people can screen their financial decisions and their consumer decisions and their manufacturing decisions on the basis of you know, what's going on with the product that they're buying. You can choose the product that you like based on its product performance, but then also based on its greenness, and that is a major advance forward and will make a major difference in things. Last but not least, our next speaker is Mr. Shutong Dong, Chairman of Nickel Resources International Holdings Limited. And thank you for your patience.
Thanks, everyone. I'm Zhao Yongpu, behalf of Dong Shutong, Chairman of Nickel Resources International. I'm from China. Nickel Resources International is located in Henan, China, and listed on Hong Kong Stock Exchange. I'll introduce my steel and new technology. I want to say, give me a chance. My steel will change the world. New times, new steel, new life. Dedication of S600E stainless steel. Humans house facing 3 problems: corrosion, earthquake, and greenhouse effect. My invention will make steel to make a construction's life from 70 years now to over 500 years. Left upside is our steel, S600E. It's high-strength stainless steel. S600E's corrosion resistance is 150 times than carbon steel, according to the calculator. Our steel will make construction last 8,000 years, at least 500 to 1,000 years. Construction damaged by rust. We just saw outside the bridge outside of Clinton Presidential Library. The bridge has only 100 years. It's it's damaged by rust. Mark, yesterday, Mark has told me many of American bridges needed to be rebuilt because of rust. Rust in volume expanding 3 to 5 times. They will damage the steel reinforced concrete. Left is carbon steel, a bridge, only 40 years. Right is the stainless steel by 304 stainless steel. It's now 80 years. Stainless steel construction has no maintenance cost in 100 years. We can saw this table. .304 and 2205 are both stainless steel, but 304 is not structural steel, and 2205 is expensive. My steel S600E cost is one third of 2205. So S600E is the new marine steel. Casualties 90s damaged by collapsed house and second disasters. Chen Wenchuan earthquake 8 grade made 69,000 persons dead and 300,000 people injured. Earthquake threat not only islands, mainlands also. This picture shows the earthquake belt in the world. Magnitude 1 grade, each difference 30 times energy, and magnitude 2, each difference will be 900 times. This is 1985 Mexico City earthquake, 8 grade earthquake. We can see steel construction, street constructors damaged less than steel reinforced concrete. This picture can show the product of yield and tensile. Our steel will absorb more energy when earthquake. So our steel is a best earthquake resistant steel. When sea levels up, many of cities will be attacked, just like Venice, New York, Manhattan. Construction used our steel. One tin will reduce carbon emissions 18 tons. and steel reinforced concrete construction used our steel 110 will reduce carbon emission 150 years. So we produce 1,000 S600 years steel will reduce carbon emissions 500 millions. Use our steel. We will build 1,000 houses. My steel is high strength, stainless, and toughness. So the house will wealthy inheriting, spiritual inheriting, and cultural inheriting. My steel and my company will be dedicated to safe, forever, and affordable houses. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That concludes this afternoon's lunch roundtable. I think you'll all agree with me. It was extraordinarily informative. There was a lot of meat here in terms of the way guidelines and standards are being used to allocate capital, the capital allocation needs for the market. I couldn't agree more with you also with the need for guarantees. In 1990, I helped develop the World Bank Guarantee Program, so I'm a little, I have a very strong familiarity and affection for the beginnings of that program. And I think the clear issue here is how you put together packages of finance with guidelines for consumers, for production, for financial institutions, so that what we end up with is leveraging of resources, small amounts of guarantees and insurance products, leveraging larger amounts of financial flows, and also creating pathways in the market. As financiers get more familiar with a certain transaction, then they become easier to do, getting them through management committees, and hopefully processes will flow with greater ease. With that, let's take a break, because I know it's been a long morning and we have a little bit more to go. It's about 1:45 now, if my time estimation is roughly correct. And we'll come back at about 2:05, give people just a chance to sort of relax and catch their breath. And I'll see you all in a little while.